What do you do when surrender means extinction, and mercy becomes a risk you can't afford? In 1565, the island of Malta became the pressure point of the entire Mediterranean, and what happened there was a neat story of heroic charges and clean victories. It was a siege measured in days bought with blood, in walls rebuilt under fire, in morale stretched until it snapped, and in decisions so harsh that later generations argue whether survival itself had rewritten the rules of war. To understand why experienced soldiers on both sides describe Malta with dread, you need to understand the map, the stakes, and the kind of enemies about to collide. The Ottoman Empire in the mid-16th century was a superpower with proven armies, an expanding coastline, and a navy that could move men and guns across the sea like a moving city. Its victories in the eastern Mediterranean had created an aura of inevitability, and the West watched every Ottoman campaign the way people watch a storm line moving toward their home. Malta, by contrast, was a hard limestone rock with few natural resources and a small population, but it sat in the exact wrong place for the Ottomans and the exact right place for their opponents. It guarded sea lanes between Ottoman North Africa and Christian Europe, and it gave the Knights of the Order of St. John, often called a Knights Hospitaller, a base from which they raided shipping, intercepted messages, and captured prizes. To the Ottomans, the Order was not just an enemy garrison. It was a permanent blade aimed at their logistics. To many European rulers, Malta was a tripwire. If it fell, Sicily would be exposed, and if Sicily looked weak, the coast of Italy would feel the pressure next. This is why, when the Ottoman decision came to strike Malta in force, panic traveled faster than any ship. Rumors inflated the numbers, diplomats begged for help, and the Pope's court prepared for the unthinkable, because nobody could ignore what Ottoman victory would signal. On Malta itself, the defense rested on a few fortified points around the Grand Harbor, especially the towns of Birgu and Sinlia, and it rested on a leader who understood something crucial about siege warfare in the gunpowder age. You rarely win by destroying besieging army. You win by refusing to be destroyed long enough for a besieger to run out time, health, supplies, and confidence. That leader was Grand Master Jean Parasat de Valette, usually known in English as La Valette, an aging commander, around 70, who had spent his life in the orb of Ottoman conflict, who understood the sea, the psychology of raids, and the way fear can either dissolve a defense or harden it into steel. Across the water stood the Ottoman commanders, men with reputations built on campaigns and discipline. Mustafa Pasha, the senior land commander, Piali Pasha, commanding the fleet, and later the Corsair Admiral Turgut Reis, known in Europe as Dragut, a veteran of Mediterranean war, whose arrival would sharpen the siege into a more coordinated and dangerous machine. The scene was set by May 18, 1565, when watchers on Malta's walls saw the horizon darken with sails. Sources differ on exact totals, but the scale was unmistakable. Hundreds of vessels, siege guns, engineers, elite infantry, and enough men to fill camps across the island's heights. Against them, Malta's defenders were far fewer. Several hundred knights, additional professional soldiers from allied lands, Maltese militia, and a civilian population that would be dragged into labor and emergency defense simply because a siege does not allow spectators. If you picture an even fight, you've already missed a point. This was never meant to be even. The Ottomans came expecting to crush a fortress system and remove a strategic nuisance. The defenders hoped to turn the campaign into a slow-motion disaster for the attackers by forcing them to pay for every meter of ground. And the first place where time would be purchased was Fort St. Elmo. Fort St. Elmo guarded the mouth of the Grand Harbor, positioned on the tip of a peninsula, like a clenched fist. It mattered because as long as St. Elmo held, the Ottomans could not freely use the harbor for their fleet, their supplies, and their artillery positioning. But St. Elmo was also exposed, vulnerable to concentrated gunfire from heights nearby, and many engineers believe it would not last long under sustained bombardment. Popular retellings sometimes compress this into a dramatic for days estimate. Whether or not anyone said that number precisely, everyone agreed on the reality behind it. St. Elmo would be punished first, and it would suffer brutally. Here is the decision that makes La Valette's strategy clear. Rather than treating St. Elmo as a disposable outpost, he reinforced it and ordered it to hold as long as humanly possible, not because he thought it could survive indefinitely, but because every extra day would allow Birgu and Sinlia to deepen trenches, stock ammunition, improve gun positions, and prepare for the moment when the Ottoman focus shifted to the main defenses. Inside St. Elmo, the men understood what hold meant. In diaries like that of Francisco Balbi di Correggio, a soldier chronicling the siege, you can feel the mix of duty and grim acceptance, because they were not defending comfort or land. They were defending time itself. Then the artillery began, and the modern reality of siege warfare arrived in full. Ottoman guns hammered the fort day after day. Some accounts describe extraordinary volumes of fire, and while exact counts are debated, the effect is beyond dispute. Stone fractured, parapets crumbled, and the defenders lived inside a storm of splinters and dust, repairing walls at night that would be cracked again by noon. This is where siege warfare becomes psychologically crushing. Not the single dramatic moment, but the repetition. Wait to impacts, fight at breaches, carry the wounded, bury or move the dead, sleep in armor, wait to impacts again. When breaches opened, Ottoman troops surged forward expecting the classic pattern of a battered fort collapsing into panic. But St. Elmo did not collapse quickly. The defenders fought with a kind of stubborn discipline that shocked their attackers, and in desperate moments they used whatever they had to slow entry into the gaps. Earth, timber, rubble, and, according to some contemporary reports, even bodies when there was no time to clear the dead, and the breach could not be left open. It's important to be honest here. Early modern siege accounts often mix accurate observation with propaganda designed to inspire allies or demonize enemies. That said, multiple sources agree that the fighting at St. Elmo became close, constant, and unusually savage even by the standards of the era. Because the fort was small, the space was tight, and once attackers reached the walls, the battle turned into grappling distance, where numbers mattered less than exhaustion and the ability to keep, replacing men at the line. As the days stretched into weeks, both sides began to feel the strain of the Maltese summer. The sun-baked armor, water became precious. Flies gathered, wounds festered, and the dead accumulated faster than they could be properly buried. Then came a turning point with enormous consequences. Turgot Rees arrived, assessed the situation, and pushed for more effective pressure, including tighter coordination and aggressive tactics. But during the operations around St. Elmo, he was mortally wounded, likely by splinters from a cannon impact, and later died. His death was not just a loss of commander. It was a blow to Ottoman confidence, and a reminder that even the best leaders could be swallowed by the randomness of artillery war. Yet even with Dragut gone, the Ottomans kept pushing, and by late June St. Elmo was barely a fort at all, more a torn shape of rubble than a coherent wall. The defenders dwindled to a small remnant. Some were too wounded to stand, and stories from a period emphasized their refusal to abandon the post, because they believed their role was to delay the enemy at any price. On June 23rd, after about a month of grinding destruction, Fort St. Elmo fell. The Ottomans raised their flags over it, but the capture came at a cost that mattered. Exact casualty numbers vary. Popular retellings often cite around 8,000 Ottoman casualties at St. Elmo, while many historians treat that figure cautiously. But the key truth is that the losses were heavy enough to change the campaign's emotional temperature. In a siege, casualties are not just arithmetic. They are tomorrow's willingness to climb another ladder into a breach, another hour under boiling shot, another week in a camp where disease begins to spread. When Ottoman commanders looked at the price of the daughter, they had to ask what the mother, the main defenses of Burgu and Singlia, would cost. After St. Elmo, the siege entered its bitter central act, the War of Nerves. Here, you will hear dramatic claims and modern versions, severed heads used as ammunition, corpses displayed as threats, bodies floated as symbols, and the historical record is complicated. What we can say with confidence is that psychological warfare played a significant role, and that both sides used displays, threats, and brutal signals intended to break morale. In the 16th century, this kind of escalation was not unheard of in desperate sieges, and in Malta it fed a cycle in which neither side wanted to appear weak, because weakness in a siege can be contagious. The defenders understood that the Ottomans were trying to make them despair. The Ottomans understood that the defenders were trying to convince them Malta was a cursed grinding mill of men. La Valette's task was to keep Burgu and Singlia from cracking under bombardment, and to keep his people believing that endurance was still possible. Ottoman artillery now focused on the main positions. Walls were battered, breaches opened, defensive works were smashed and rebuilt, and the defenders learned the rhythm of survival. Patch at night, fire at dawn, counterattack when possible, retreat into inner works when necessary, and always always prevent an Ottoman foothold from widening into a flood. In July and early August, the pressure climbed toward a decisive assault. Ottoman troops massed, guns concentrated, and commanders prepared to force entry through multiple breaches. On August 7th, the Ottomans launched a major attack that brought the defense close to failure. Fighting surged into damaged sections. Banners appeared where they should not have been, and for a moment the outcome seemed to tilt. Here, the sources emphasized La Valette's personal presence, an old man in armor moving toward the worst fighting. Not because he was chasing glory, but because in siege warfare morale could be the difference between a line reforming and a line disintegrating. When a leader is seen where danger is greatest, exhausted men sometimes find one more reserve of strength, and in Malta, those reserves mattered. But the defense was not carried by knights alone, and this is one of the siege's most important realities. Civilians became part of the machine of survival. They carried water and powder. They moved stones and timber. They worked under fire. And in extreme moments, some fought at choke points because there was simply nobody else to do it. Modern telling sometimes dramatized women and children as frontline fighters. The more careful way to understand it is that in a siege, the entire population is pulled into defense in different roles. And when the walls are breached, the distance between support and combat can shrink to nothing in a single hour. What matters is the collective refusal to yield. The August assault was contained, and when the smoke cleared, the Ottomans had failed to break the main defenses despite weeks of preparation. That failure did not end the siege, but deepened a dangerous problem for the attackers. Time was no longer on their side. By late summer, an enemy appeared that no commander could discipline into obedience: disease. Camps crowded with thousands of men, sanitation strained, heat intensifying decay, water sources under pressure, wounds turning septic. These conditions create outbreaks of dysentery and fevers, and both sides suffered. Besieging armies often suffer more, because they must maintain a large camp in hostile conditions, and because their men are exposed to the same heat and filth, but without the protection of solid shelters. Some accounts accuse the defenders of deliberately spreading contamination, by dumping waste, by launching carcasses, by fouling areas near enemy lines. Deliberate biological warfare is hard to prove in detail for Malta, and sensational claims should be treated cautiously. But the broader truth stands. The environment became a weapon, and sickness weakened Ottoman effectiveness at the worst possible time. Disease is not only physical, it is psychological. A soldier can face a wall and understand risk. Disease makes men feel helpless, makes food and water feel suspicious, makes camps feel cursed. As illness spread, Ottoman morale began to fray. Soldiers still had courage, but courage becomes harder to summon when every day is heat, flies, exhaustion, and the sense that the island itself is consuming you. Ottoman commanders still had men and guns, but they were losing something far more important: the belief that victory was inevitable. Meanwhile, La Valette's defenders were also burning down to bone. They were short men, short of supplies, and living in ruins, but they had one strategic advantage that mattered more with every passing week. They were still holding. All summer, European powers had promised relief from Sicily, and on Malta those promises sometimes felt like fantasy. But in early September, help finally moved. The relief force is commonly cited around 8,000, though not all landed at once, and not all were veterans. Still, in the psychology of the moment, numbers on paper mattered less than what the Ottomans believed was happening. Ottoman troops had been grinding against Malta for months, losing men, losing leaders, and watching assaults fail against offenses that refused to collapse. When scouts began reporting enemy movement and dust clouds inland, rumors multiplied. In war, fear inflates opposing numbers faster than any messenger can correct them. A small initial landing in advance, sometimes dramatized as a few hundred men moving boldly, contribute to the impression of a much larger force arriving, and here's the key. Once an army believes it may be trapped between fortifications and a fresh relief army, even a disciplined command can face panic. Mustafa Pasha had to choose between staying longer and risking encirclement, or withdraw and preserve what remained of his force. Withdrawal in theory can be orderly. Withdrawal in a demoralized camp can become a stampede. By September 11th, the Ottoman fleet was gone, leaving behind abandoned equipment, shattered camps, and the silent proof that Malta had survived. The defenders did not chase far. Many were too exhausted, too wounded, and too few. When the last sails disappeared, Victory looked nothing like celebration. It looked like broken walls, burned buildings, ruined streets, and the immediate emergency of sanitation, recovery, and preventing further outbreaks. Casualty estimates vary, but they are consistently grim. Ottoman losses likely reach into the tens of thousands, while Malta's defenders, knights, soldiers, and Maltese civilians lost a devastating portion of their strength, with whole families and communities scarred. Diaries describe scenes that are hard to imagine without flinching. The difficulty of recognizing the dead after weeks in heat, the weight of constant bombardment, the strange way silence feels after months of impact and shouting. And then there is the aftermath that numbers cannot capture: psychological damage. People who survive a prolonged siege often struggle to accept peace. They sleep lightly, mistrust quiet, and remain trapped in the habits of survival. The Great Siege of Malta did not single-handedly invent modern war, but revealed with brutal clarity several realities that would shape the future. It demonstrated the power and limits of gunpowder siegecraft. Stone walls alone were not enough, and defense required layered works, rapid repair, disciplined fire, and the ability to move men quickly to threatened points. It proved that morale can beat mathematics. The Ottomans had numbers and guns, but as time passed they paid for every day, and once confidence cracked, every new assault became harder to justify and harder to execute. It showed the strategic importance of civilians in prolonged warfare, not as a slogan, but as a practical reality, because labor, logistics, and emergency defense can decide whether a fortress holds long enough for help to arrive. It highlighted psychological warfare as a deliberate tool. Threats, displays, propaganda, and calculated intimidation were used to shape decisions. And even when specific stories are exaggerated, the method is undeniable: break the enemy's will, and you may not need to destroy every wall. Malta's survival also had wider consequences. It slowed Ottoman momentum in the Western Mediterranean and energized European alliances in ways that mattered later, including in the period leading to Lepanto in 1571, with a balance of naval confidence would shift dramatically. But Malta leaves behind an uncomfortable question that no dramatic narration can fully escape. When people believe their survival is at stake, how far will they go, and what do they become in the process? Some modern versions of the story present brutality as a secret that won the siege, but that is too simple and too dangerous. The defenders survived because of strategy, terrain, engineering, leadership, discipline, and a willingness to endure, and yes, in that endurance, the war grew cruel in ways that should not be romanticized. The Ottomans did not fail because they lacked courage. They failed because sieges punish attackers, because disease and logistics do not care about reputation, and because morale, once broken, can turn strength into hesitation at exactly the wrong time. After the siege, the knights built a new fortified city on the peninsula above the harbor, Valletta, named for La Valette, designed as a response to everything 1565 had exposed about artillery, angles, and defense in depth. Today the limestone glows, the harbors look calm, and tourists walk where cannon once spoke. But the island's beauty hides the fact that for 4 months Malta became a furnace in which two powers tested the outer edge of human endurance. The Great Siege of Malta is not a simple tale of good and evil. It is a story of pressure, fear, and decision-making in a world where the walls were the border between life and catastrophe. Malta did not survive because it was invincible. It survived because it refused to stop resisting until the attackers could no longer afford the price of continuing. And that, more than any legend, is why the siege still matters.